All right.
All right. Welcome to the initial presentation of the Calumet Revisited Forum in its 9th season. I am Michael Bowes of the Association for the Wolf Lake Initiative. I am co-host with Dr. Valerie Pennanen of Calumet College of St. Joseph. Calumet Revisited is funded in part by the Indiana Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Before we hear from tonight's speaker, are there any announcements? If not, I have sorry. If not, I have one. The Calumet Nature Exchange meets via Zoom at 7 p.m. Tuesday, September 20th. Licensed teachers in Illinois and Indiana can earn 1 hour of professional development credit for attending. The presentation this evening is being recorded. The recording will be available within a week on Ollie's website. Would everyone please remain on mute? After the presentation, we will have a question and answer session. Tonight, we will hear from Dr. Philip Scarpino, environmental historian from IUPUI, who will be speaking about the Anthropocene epoch. Phil?
Are you going to look at it or what?
Phil, would you like to start?
Oh yeah, Michael, I can't see you anymore, so I was
Okay.
just waiting for a verbal cue.
Okay.
In fact, I can't see any of the participants, so that's fine.
For some reason, I can't either. I don't.
That's okay. You can see me, right?
Yes, I can see you.
And you can hear me.
I can hear you.
And I assume the people that are, all right, so I see somebody named Walter who's got his mic on. Walter, can you see and hear me?
I can hear you, but I can't see you.
All right. I'm not sure what we can do about that. Michael, do you think we can fix this or should we just go with it?
I think we should just go with it.
All right. So, all right. Well, Michael, thank you. My name is Philip Scarpino. I am a professor of history at Indiana University, Purdue University at Indianapolis. Although our name is about to change. It's going to be shortened because of some considerable amount of reorganization within the state. But I've lived with IUPUI for more than 30 years as a name. So what Michael asked me to do was to give kind of an overview of American environmental history, and I will use Northern Indiana, Northeastern Illinois, Chicago area examples to the degree that I can. And then I hope that we can have a little fun question and answer when I'm done. And Michael's got a clock on me because I can't see a clock. So, all right. So what I want to do is an overview of American environmental history, which is a tall order, in 35 minutes or whatever, but we'll see how well I can pull this one off. This is maybe it's fitting that this is a high elevation picture of Wolf Lake, because I'm going to do a high elevation look at environmental history as well. So somebody's got a live mic. You probably don't want whatever you're saying to go out over the airways. All right, so here we go. This is a thimbleberry leaf, as some of you may know, that I took on Isle Royal, but I'm just using this as background. So what's environmental history is the question that I often get asked. And basically it's the story, it's the story of the interplay between people and their surroundings over time. It's not necessarily about nature or whatever. It's about the places in which people live. And unlike most history or most historical stories, this is a story what helps to start in the present. Right? And what I always encourage people to do is, later on, look around the place that you live and ask, how did it get that way? How did it get that way? And when you answer that question, or in the process of answering that question, it encourages you to think historically. How did the place get the way it is over time? And to recognize one of the bedrock principles of environmental history, and that is environmental history is the story of the creation of place over time. Right? So if we think about the creation of place over time, or thinking in terms of the creation of place over time, is also an important element in the public interpretation of environmental history. In other words, in a museum or a historical society or wherever that, a documentary, wherever that might happen. And so I'm going to use the United States to illustrate my points. But I'm doing that so that I can get my intellectual arms around something in 35 or 40 minutes. But it's important to keep in mind that human impact or human interaction with the environment, human impact on the environment is global in scope. It's not just limited to the United States or North America. I'm doing this as a device to keep this under control. So, North Americans imagined and interpreted nature from the time that Euro-Americans set foot in what is now North America. There were indigenous people here before them, and I'm going to talk about Euro-Americans because they're the ones that have had the greatest impact on changing the place. So I needed a visual, and I picked this painting called Across the Continent, done by a female artist named Fanny Palmer in 1868. It's a Currier and Ives print, and a reason that I picked this is two reasons. One is that it really does a good job of illustrating attitudes toward nature that people saw in popular culture in the years after the Civil War. And because Palmer was a well-known artist and printmaker, one of the few women who was successful in that field, and Currier and Ives was an extremely successful printmaking firm. If you find prints around today, chances are they're Currier and Ives or somebody ripped them off from Currier and Ives. So if you look at this picture that Fanny Palmer painted and Currier and Ives published in 1868, it's sort of the story of how a lot of Euro-Americans wanted to imagine their impact on their surroundings, and they wanted to imagine progress. So if you look in this little village here, you see these wagons, right? And that's the pioneers. And you see some men here engaged in agriculture. And the story, of course, is that the pioneers come into an area, they build civilization, they build a town, they plant crops, and they begin to prosper. The train is a symbol of that progress, headed straight off into the future and alongside of the telegraph lines, which were the first internet. And here are the Native Americans, symbolically in the coal smoke of the train, indicating that they've been left behind by what's about to happen. But you get this idea in this picture that, America at that time was about progress, and progress meant subduing nature and converting it into civilization. So here's the point. People transform their surroundings by acting on the attitudes and values embedded in their culture. And I'm telling you that because it places the study of the environment squarely in the arena of history. It belongs to science and other disciplines, but it also properly fits into history. So I'm going to start by talking about the attitudes and values that influence the environmental transformation by Americans before the mid-20th century. What attitudes and values were they acting on when they changed their surroundings? Right? So let's do this. And I'm basically talking the colonial period, so sometime in the early 1600s, depending on where we are. A little earlier if we get into the Southwest and look at the Spanish influence. And so well into the 20th century. All right. What were the attitudes that influence how people interacted with their surroundings? And we start with religion and God. Right. people believe that God created people superior to the rest of nature, right? And that God gave nature to people or to humanity for its use, so that nature existed to serve the needs of people. That was a bedrock value. Right? Now, how could we come to a conclusion like this? We can start by looking in the Bible, which most people were reading. In fact, for many people, that was the book they had in their house. It has its roots in the Judeo-Christian tradition. You know, if you want to look it up, Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, that says, "And God said, let us make man in our image and after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl, over the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and everything that creepeth upon the earth." That's pretty capacious. Basically, according to Genesis, God gave people everything that's out there for their use. Again, attitudes and values that shape the relationship between Americans and nature, that land, or nature more generally, can be owned as private property, and proof of ownership is an improvement, right? If you hold it and don't do anything with it, it's not proof that you own it. And that's a major departure from indigenous people. You know, indigenous people did not think in terms of land as private property. Right? Nature is a collection of commodities that have an abstract monetary value in a market. You know, you can harvest beaver, you can skin them, you can tan the hides or whatever, and you can sell them, make money. And when we look at how people acted on their attitudes and values to transform their surroundings, this triumvirate of property, commodity, and market really powerfully reshaped the face of the land. Right? So then there's the belief that nature is infinite, right? Now, people weren't stupid. I mean, they realized that if you chop the tree down, it's gone for a while. But generally speaking, that nature was possessed of unlimited abundance. There was always more somewhere. And that included both resources and the ability to absorb waste. I mean, there used to be this old, you know, what my mother called old wives' tale, that flowing water purifies itself every mile. That's not true, by the way, but that's what people said. You know, you could dump your waste in the water and it'll self-purify. There was the idea that nature had to be conquered and controlled in the name of progress and civilization. How do we know we're doing it right? We do our best to bring nature under control. And then nature can be divided into good and bad. And the role of people is to maximize the good or control or eliminate the bad. So deer are good, we want them around. Wolves and bears are bad because they eat the deer, we don't want them. That sort of thing. Farm fields are good with crops in them. Woodchucks are bad, or groundhogs are bad because they make holes and get dirt that gets caught up in the harvesting machines. That sort of thing. So here's a point. And let me see if I can move the folks so I can read my own. Everybody, every human being that has ever lived transforms their surroundings to meet their needs by acting on the attitudes and values embedded in their culture. Now, sometimes people, of course, can imagine things that they can't do because they don't have the technology to do it. But this statement is true for every human that's ever lived on the face of the earth. So then how does that knowledge that all human beings transform their surroundings to meet their needs by acting on the attitudes and values embedded in their culture, how does that shed light on the historical relationship between people and nature? You know, how might we use that knowledge to shape public interpretation of environmental history? And this is something I would say to people who are maybe interested in a museum exhibit or something. So I start with the idea of material culture. I'm going to get to the Anthropocene, but we're going to start here. So there was this archaeologist who's relatively recently deceased named James Dietz. And he wrote this lovely little book called In Small Things Forgotten. And in that book and in other places, he defined material culture as that portion of man's physical environment purposely transformed by him according to culturally dictated plans. So you got to do it on purpose, and it's driven by culture. And when I first read that, when I brought my training to this as an environmental historian, I saw a lot more than stuff in cases, right? Artifacts in cases, or stuff that you might dig up in a Native American site. If you think about that definition and let it roll around in your mind and percolate through the synapses or whatever, what you realize is most of the world meets that definition. That purpose, that portion of man's physical environment purposely transformed by him according to culturally dictated plans. We live in a world that is pretty much a human artifact. And I'm going to talk more about this later on, but we have so transformed our surroundings that we live on a globe that's pretty much a human artifact. So, a few illustrations. This is downtown Indianapolis in 1906, that portion of man's physical environment purposely transformed by him. Now, you know, downtown, busy city, you can see the trolley in the front, right in front of the state capitol. People weren't too happy about the coal smoke, but that was also, in that world, is a symbol of progress. You know, smoke means progress, right? So downtown Indianapolis in 2007, I happened to get a clear day flying into Indianapolis International Airport. That portion of man's physical environment purposely transformed by him. You know, it's a little cleaner than it was in 100 years earlier. It's changed a lot, but it meets that definition of material culture. Rectangular survey, right? Section, township, and range has powerfully marked the face of the land in most of the United States. You know, we have a farmscape and suburban development in Indiana. If you know this area, I was flying out of the airport headed north toward Lafayette, and it was a clear day, and I managed to get this picture. And you can see the impact of the rectangular survey on the land, but you can also see the impact of suburban development as it encroaches upon agriculture. There's actually a lot in this picture that portion of man's physical environment. This is not Indiana. This is somewhere in North Texas, taken about 36,000 feet. But this is irrigation landscape, center pivot irrigation. And if you're not familiar with this, they basically suck the water out of the groundwater and then put it on the land in a rotating irrigation system. And those circles are a quarter of a section, which is about 160 acres. So what you're basically able to do is to grow crops in a relatively arid region, but that portion of man's physical environment purposely transformed by him according to culturally dictated plans. This is the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest in the Eagle Cap Wilderness in Oregon. It's in northeastern Oregon. That portion of man's physical environment purposely transformed by him according to culturally dictated plans. I took this picture. If you want to look it up, this peak is called Sacagawea, and those are some of my hiking partners ahead of me. So we're up there in this wilderness area, and we see this mountain sheep. And you can see the mountain sheep sees us too. Look at his head's cocked to the side. He's trying to figure out, what is that? Oh my goodness, what is that? I haven't seen a lot of people up in his area of operation. You know, he wasn't so nervous that he was unwilling to lay down. And as I got closer, you see his nostrils flare, and he's still trying to figure out what I am. And if you want to get an idea of the steepness, look at the snow behind him. Then I got really close. I zoomed in. Take a look at his ear. That's a tag. That portion of man's physical environment purposely transformed by him. These things were reintroduced into an area in which they become extinct to try to restore the integrity of the ecosystem. So I would argue that even wilderness areas, and I've hiked a bunch of them, you know, the Bob Marshall in Montana, the Selway Bitterroot, and so on. These are really remnants of natural history, restored and preserved and managed on behalf of people who value those places, partly for historical reasons. I mean, think about this for a minute. Suppose we could bring our ancestors back, you know, from the early 1800s or the middle of the 1800s or late 1700s, and we could sit them down and we could tell them, the world has changed so much since you left. And one of the things we do now is we protect large areas of undeveloped land and keep people out and let nature run its course. They'd look at you like you'd gone bonkers, right? They would have spent their whole life doing just the opposite, right? Trying to subdue nature. So I'm going to argue that the environment that surrounds us is as much a human artifact as it is a natural system. Our environment, the place in which we live, has been profoundly shaped by people acting on the attitudes and values embedded in their culture. There isn't much that's natural, in quotes, about the world we live in. So In the present, like today, the environment has become an interdependent, interconnected, humanized system. Interdependent means what happens in one place influences what happens in another, and interconnected means it's all hooked up. So it's a human artifact, an example of human material culture. So this is the Mississippi River near Minneapolis, St. Paul. And what you're looking at here is the intersection of several transportation systems, interstate highways, the river, the railroads, and I'm in an airplane and I wasn't flying it. So, we're on approach to Minneapolis, St. Paul airport. So, an interconnected, humanized system, but it's pretty much all parts are hooked together in a common system as an example of human material culture. So then we move ahead in time, post-World War II. World War II ended in 1945. There are two big shifts in understanding the relationship between people and nature. There are probably more than two, but I'm a simple guy and I could only think of two. So one is ecology and the ecology-based environmental movement in the 1960s and 70s. I'm going to mention a couple of popularizers of ecology, Rachel Carson and Aldo Leopold. And then there's the idea of the Anthropocene. We then would have to talk about Paul Crutzen, and I put et al., that means and all his friends, who really brought this idea to the fore in 2000, although he's not the first person that thought of that. So let's start with the environmental movement of the 1960s and 70s, because that's a game changer, right? Not everybody was an environmentalist, not everybody went along with this, but the philosophy of the environmental movement was a game changer in terms of the way people looked at their surroundings. So among the most important reasons why we had an environmental movement was concern over the unintended and unanticipated consequences of modern technology, right? Concern over growing damage to the surrounding environment. So DDT, right? It belongs to a family of pesticides called chlorinated hydrocarbons. There's another family called organophosphates, but they basically all kill bugs. At first, people saw this as kind of a miracle compound. For the first time in all of the history of humanity, it was possible to get rid of the insects that spread disease and ruin food and crops, right? But then people, as we used this, began to realize that there were consequences associated to the use of this. One of them was bioaccumulation. Right? So let's have a look. So in the 1960s and 70s, we saw in this country the emergence of a grassroots environmental movement that represented a rejection or a modification of many of those traditional attitudes toward nature. Now, not everybody was an environmentalist. It would be silly for me to say that. So the question is, why did the environmental movement emerge in the 1960s? And a better question might be what happened to it, but I'm not going to do that today. So post-World War II, why did we have an environmental movement? Start with the fact that many Americans enjoyed economic prosperity. Not everybody fit into this, but the majority of Americans, life was better than it had been in a long time. Better than war, better than depression. Aldo Leopold called the environmental movement, conservation movement, a full belly movement. And what he meant was people who are hungry and worried about where their next meal is going to come from are not the environmentalists or the conservationists. Number two, we had a baby boom underway, and it lasted from the end of World War II. I'm a baby boom kid. Until sometime in the mid-60s. So it wasn't just that, men and women had been apart, because if that was the case, the baby boom would have been over in a half an hour. It was sustained because these people thought they were bringing children into a world that was better than the one they'd grown up in, right? So the parents are having these babies and they have a desire to maintain a healthy surrounding in which to raise all those children. Didn't mean they were environmentalists, but it did mean they cared about the place in which they live. So the pictures I've got here on the top is a nursery in Manitowoc, Wisconsin, that had been expanded to hold 60 beds for additional babies because the babies were coming. And the bottom is a picture of the first atomic explosion in the Nevada test site, or January 27, 1951. Between 1951 and 63, we were averaging one test every 3 weeks in Nevada. All right. Now, purposely done in remote areas because the folks who did this realized that atomic explosions were not good for other living things. But we were testing in the atmosphere. So why did the environmental movement emerge in the 60s? Concern about the unintended and unanticipated consequences of new technologies. And one of those was the above ground testing of atomic weapons and the growing fear among the public of fallout and radiation. There's a component of fallout called strontium-90. It tends to move through the environment in company with calcium, which means that it ended up in places where you find calcium, like bones and teeth and so on. And so parents are coming to realize that these kids they were bringing in the world were likely ended up with strontium-90 in their bones and teeth. So there was also the concern about widespread indiscriminate use of synthetic organic compounds. Synthetic means man-made, organic means carbon-based, but the big one was DDT and a whole range of other pesticides and herbicides. And the problem that we found out was they did exactly what they were intended to do, but there were consequences like bioaccumulation, right? Or the fact that they would kill the good insects as well as the bad. DDT doesn't care if it's a honeybee or a fly. So in the top, you've got the same two pictures just to illustrate my points. All right, so above ground testing of nuclear weapons and the story of strontium-90. United States did some of its testing on a place called Bikini Atoll, out a remote island in the Pacific. By 1951, the U.S. had exploded 16 bombs, the Soviet Union 13, Britain did its first test in 1952. We were all testing in the atmosphere. And what happened was that it would get blasted, the debris from the explosions would get blasted up into the stratosphere, circulate around the globe, and return to Earth as fallout. That's why it's called fallout. And one of the components of fallout was strontium-90, which, as I've already said, moves through the environment in company with calcium. So there was the widespread indiscriminate use of DDT and related compounds. DDT did a dynamite job of what it was intended to do, which is kill insects. We waged war on mosquitoes in this country and around the world to eliminate diseases like malaria and so on. But what we didn't realize until we began to use it on a regular basis is it also bioaccumulates. You know, the DDT kills the insect, the bird eats, 10 insects or 20 or however many they eat. The eagle eats 5 birds, right? And every time that moves on, it concentrates in the next host. And we're at the top of the food pyramid, and it concentrated in us as well. So there are also two classic images that fanned the environmental movement. And one of these is this popular picture, the burning of the Cuyahoga River, that appeared on the cover of Time magazine in July 1966. Maybe some of you saw that. The problem is that Time got it wrong. This picture was actually taken in 1952. The Cuyahoga did burn in 1966. We just don't have any pictures of it. But why was it burning? Because it was so polluted and so covered with petroleum and other residue that the top of the water caught on fire. And the other is this, an image that helped create the constituency for environmental movement. This is the blue marble image taken from Apollo 17, December 7, 1972. And when people look at that, it's hard not to realize that this is it. This is the whole game. Hanging there in space, surrounded by blackness, there is nothing but this. And if we don't take care of it, it's on us. So those two ideas help to drive the environmental movement as well. So then there were popular books like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which used ecology as a model of analysis. Silent Spring was an international bestseller, translated into at least 17 languages. I taught in China. It's definitely translated into Chinese, Spanish. But popularized ecology was what provided the scientific and philosophical underpinning of the environmental movement. Right? Simple concepts like everything is connected to everything else. Those who make war on nature eventually make war on themselves. That's the message. When you cut through all the data and everything in that book, that's the message. Right? And I love this picture in the upper left-hand corner. Truck spraying DDT in 1945 to eliminate mosquitoes on Jones Beach. People are out there bathing and the fogger truck is coming by. Right? The second important book was Sand County Almanac, published in 1959, written by Aldo Leopold. It actually came out a year after his death. Somebody's got a live mic. I don't know who it is, but So Leopold was a forester. He almost single-handedly created the field of wildlife management. He was an environmental philosopher, professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So this book comes out in 1949, and to say sales were slow would be charitable. I mean, I'm sure that his mom bought a copy and so on, but it didn't sell well. But by the late 1980s, this book had gone through over 40 printings and been translated into at least 12 languages. Because as the environmental movement began to develop, people began to look for things that reinforced where they were already going, right? Which was an ecological perspective on the relationship between people and nature. So along with Silent Spring, this is one of the most influential books on the environment published in the 20th century. So like Rachel Carson, Leopold challenged traditional attitudes and practices. And he also pointed out the connections between human and natural history. So one quote from Leopold, maybe if you've seen this somewhere else before, now you know where it came from. He says that man is in fact only a member of a biotic team as shown by an ecological interpretation of history. Many historical events hitherto explained solely in terms of human experience were actually biotic interactions between people and the land. The characteristics of the land determined the facts quite as potently as the characteristics of the men who lived on it. Now, if we take out the men and put in gender neutral language, it would still work today, right? This is an ecological perspective, the kind of thing that fired the environmental movement. You know, this point of view influenced the emergence of the field of environmental history, for example, in the 1970s and 80s. My academic advisor was one of the first environmental historians in the world, and she was an Aldo Leopold scholar. So let me connect the dots here. Post-World War II, we have unintended and unanticipated consequences of new technologies like DDT. We have popularized ecology, Aldo Leopold and Rachel Carson. You put those two things together, and we have what fuels the creation of the modern environmental movement that in many ways was a rejection of earlier attitudes toward nature. So I love this cartoon, and you guys are from the Chicago area, so you can see the cartoonist was Bill Malden, who was a really famous cartoonist. It was published in the Chicago Sun-Times, September 1, 1962, and then it was syndicated, so it's probably all over the place. But here's your suburban guy. See that tie? If anybody still got one in their closet, don't own up to it. But this is the whole war on nature thing, right? So here's the bug coming down, but if you're of that generation, this is like a fighter being shot down in a dogfight, spiraling down to the ground. And down here in the corner is ACAC bug bomb. ACAC is slang for anti-aircraft guns, the kind usually mounted on ships. You can see them in old World War II movies. And the whole message here is, you know, those who make war on nature also make war on themselves. You do the bug in, you do yourself in. It was the message in this cartoon that Bill Malden drew, published in the Chicago Sun-Times in September of 1962. Right. So bottom line, the ecology-based environmental movement played a huge role in redefining the purpose and value of wetlands, right? Which is what a lot of people in northern Indiana and northeastern Illinois are interested in. You know, scientists and environmentalists began to think in terms of ecological integrity. Right? And if you're thinking in terms of ecological integrity, then wetlands become an important part of a healthy ecosystem. And we begin to see the transition of wetlands from waste, right, wasted space that needs to be drained, to essential components of a healthy ecosystem. So, second major point that in changing the relationship or the understanding between people and the environment is the idea of the Anthropocene. Person who's usually given credit for this is a man named Paul Crutzen, PhD, Meteorology Institute, Stockholm University in 1968. He did path-breaking research basically on the ozone. And in 1995, Crutzen and two men named Frank Rowland and Mario Molina shared the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for their findings on ozone depletion. So I'm telling you this because when Crutzen had an opinion, people listened. This guy won a Nobel Prize. Right? And he is the person who's credited with coming up with the idea of the Anthropocene. He said, or he told the author of this book, I was at a conference where someone said something about the Holocene, the long period of relatively stable climate since the end of the last ice age. I suddenly thought, this is wrong. The world has changed too much. So I said, no, we're in the Anthropocene. I just made up the word on the spur of the moment. Everyone was shocked, but it seems to have stuck. And I then quoted from two of the scholars of the Anthropocene, Robin Libby and Will W. Stefan, in 2007, saying it's a new geological epoch, reflecting the scientific fact that anthropogenic change is now shaping planetary systems. Describing changes to the Earth system over time demands an understanding of the biological factors, the human factors, and their integration. And the big point here is to realize the profound role that human beings have had in reshaping the Earth environment and to integrate human history with natural history, right? So, Anthropocene world. Advocates propose the Anthropocene be designated as a new geological epoch, replacing the Holocene. Jury's still out on that. I think it's going to happen. I know some of the people that are working on it, but it's a slow process. Anthropocene marked by human agency as a driving force in worldwide environmental change. Doesn't mean people are responsible for all changes. It doesn't mean we can control everything, but a major driving force in worldwide environmental change. The results of human action so profound that they can be measured in the sedimentary record, that's the mud at the bottom of ponds and rivers and stuff, and eventually in the stratigraphic record. That's when that mud becomes stone in a couple million years, right? Now, there's considerable discussion over when to mark the start of the Anthropocene. People are sort of gravitating toward 1800, but it's kind of up in the air. And it's not yet officially been designated as a new geological epoch, although that process is underway. Even so, the Anthropocene has clearly become an unofficial successor to the Holocene as the new geological epoch, right? So, a point. The Anthropocene is also important as an idea, right? As an intellectual lens through which to study and evaluate the interaction between people and the environment over time, realizing the degree to which human action is a driving force. And the thing I like about the Anthropocene, it doesn't just deal with the stuff people did on purpose. It also takes into account the unintended and unanticipated consequences of their actions. All right. So, implications of the Anthropocene. It removes what has become an increasingly artificial divide between natural and cultural environment, between natural and human history. Understanding human agency through the lens of the Anthropocene will require sustained interdisciplinary collaboration. It's not just a science problem. It's not just a history problem. It's a human problem and needs to be addressed in an interdisciplinary fashion. Culture plays a powerful role in shaping the interaction between people and the environment. So I would argue that science alone is not enough to understand or alter behaviors that drive environmental change, especially when the problems and solutions are complex and the relationships between cause and effect are both indirect and long-term. We cannot deal with the Anthropocene or the problems of the Anthropocene through science alone. So 1.1 is when it comes to understanding or changing behavior that impact the environment, what people think and believe is just about as important as the verifiable results of scientific change. And point 2, emphasizing the role of human agency makes history an important and even an essential part of studying and interpreting the environment. So, a few more implications and I'll wrap this up. Our humanized environment buffers and masks absolute dependence on nature. It's possible for us to think, sitting in our air-conditioned homes, that we're somehow insulated from the vicissitudes of nature, but it just masks it. We're as dependent upon nature as any human has ever been. Human life, nearly all life on Earth, depends, as it always has, on photosynthesis. Right? Human life depends on and requires fertile soil, clean and sufficient water, sustainable access to natural resources. There is much that we did not create and that we cannot control. But even so, our environment, the place we live in, the place that surrounds us, the globe, is the product of a historical process that created place over time. The place we created rests on a foundation of values and attitudes embedded in culture. The place that we have created is a cultural artifact. It's a mix of natural and humanized parts. So what? This is the point. Managing the environment requires paying as much attention to culture as it does to science. It matters what people think and believe and want and dream. So, two closing points with my lily in the background. One is that despite our power, human beings, like all other life on Earth, depend absolutely on the natural world. And point two, an obligation is to be stewards working to protect and restore the environment we all share and upon which we all depend, may be the most important lesson derived from studying the history of the environment. Thank you for listening to me, and I'm happy to try to answer questions. But I can only see I can only see one person now, so somehow you're going to have to let me know if you have a question.
I'm checking chat to see if
Yeah, I got the setup, so I can't see in the chat, so you're going to have to help me here, Michael.
and I can't.
I wonder if you stop sharing screen, if you would see the grid of people.
I can do that. Let's see what happens. Ah, there's well, I see more people.
Yeah.
With Mr. Attitude of Gratitude in the middle.
Yeah, we see him.
And I don't know if you can see me or not, because I
Yeah.
must be here somewhere. All right.
You mentioned that the beginning of the Anthropocene may be about 1800. Wasn't that the time of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution?
Yeah, that's where the literature seems to be headed. That if we're looking at a point where human impact, the results of human impact become profound enough that we could be entering this new geological epoch with evidence first in the sedimentary and then in the stratigraphic record, that industrialization is probably the place to begin. Now, the problem with that is that it's pretty, Eurocentric, or so I've seen other people use things like the spread of corn or maize around the globe. It is possible to document the spread of that, which was originally a New World crop, by looking at the pollen residue in sediment. And I've seen some pretty interesting stuff on that. But right now, the scholarship that I read seems to be gravitating toward the Industrial Revolution. And of course, that happens at a differential rate around the world. It didn't happen in China at the same time it happened in the United States. It didn't happen in the United States at the same time it happened in England. So, yes, that's where things seem to be headed.
Thank you.
Can you speak to, in a sense, in any way, even in this modern moment, then, if we're talking about sort of dominant Western conceptions of nature, are non-Western or Native American perceptions also part of what's changing our perception in the current moment, or do they seem incidental?
I guess it depends on who we were talking about when we talk about our perceptions. I doubt that Native American perceptions of the environment are not uniform. And they were obviously complicit in dramatic transformation of the environment once they entered a market economy, which they didn't necessarily do at the point of a gun. But, I have taught twice in China, and I taught in Colombia, South America. And when I talk to my students who range from, undergraduates to grown-up adults, they seem to agree with what I'm saying. I mean, even my Chinese students were saying that this sounds a lot. Now, not similar values. I mean, they're not talking about they're all going to go to the polls and vote on this. But the idea, that underlay it, that they didn't find those to be alien concepts. Um, I think it might be possible to argue that the kinds of economies that developed in Western Europe and North America drove a lot of the expectations for what success looked like around the world. And that doesn't mean that everybody agrees with this. I can remember Bogota, Colombia, I think the airport's at a little over 8,000 feet and the campus is, knocking on 9. So, but when you look up at the hillsides around Bogota, there are all these people that just come from everywhere because they can't live. They're in stuff they knock together with whatever they could find. Do those people benefit from a modernizing country that is putting its emphasis on North American style industrialization? I'm not sure that's true. But I do think that it did set a standard that a lot of places around the world aspired to. And they also seem to run into the same problems that we do. I mean, one of the things that I remember about being in China is the horrifying air in Chinese cities. And the people are nice. I mean, they treated me nicely. I had a great time meeting Chinese people and speaking with them and so on. But the air is awful. And it has to do with largely unregulated industrialization. It's like looking at pictures of Pittsburgh in 1910,
Yeah, but are you saying then to I guess the question I'm asking is, given that there's sort of a global market economy, sort of capitalist system, then are you saying that in a sense, even in Colombia, even in China, you found that people starting to question some of the assumptions that underlie that about the sort of infinite fecundity of the earth and its ability to absorb everything, that they're starting to question them for the same reasons that we are, say, here in North America, and that they were even influenced by some of the things like maybe the photograph that came back from the Apollo mission or things like that.
Yeah, although we want to kind of keep in mind that photograph, most of my students wouldn't even, I mean, if I told them what it was, they'd know, but there's no instant recognition like, life memories of this.
Okay.
Sure. Of course, in China, you have to be kind of careful what you say. You can't criticize the government. I mean, you can trash the hell out of Japan, but you have to be very careful about what you say about your own country.
Yeah.
So are there places in the world where people recognize that small may be better than big and closer to the local may be better than international and so on? Yes. It will be interesting to see what kind of an impact that has over the long haul. Whether it's, a niche movement or whether and somehow we're able to recognize that we are going to face a crisis, right? That the globe simply can't support a growing population, growing industrial base, growing extraction of resources without something giving way. I don't know where the tipping point is. But certainly, I mean, I just came back from a conference in Germany and met a bunch of people in South Africa. They're certainly keenly aware of the environmental costs of human actions and so on. But
I have a question about that.
So
If there is, I'll try to be brief. I realize other people have questions too. This is so interesting. So if all of this is based on, attitudes and values, and the attitudes and values are what shapes our relationship to the environment, what happens if our attitudes and values change to, well, we can't do anything about it. Let's just make the most of what we got right now and forget about it.
there certainly are people that have that point of view.
Well, I know that, but I mean, I guess the attitudes and values shift over time, as we have seen. And so it could go, now we have a lot of people concerned, but that could also change.
I mean, one thing that I would have done, if I had more time or whatever, is it's interesting to look at opinion polls on the subject of the environment. and look at what people are concerned about. And, you know, there is a surprisingly consistent, relatively high level of concern about the surrounding environment. But what doesn't appear to happen is that it translates into political action.
Mhm.
You know, that people vote for members of Congress or the Senate or, you know, whomever, the president. I mean, I don't want to insult anybody's politics, but we just came off of a term of a president who definitely set the clock back in terms of, you know, environmental regulation and so on and so forth.
Yes.
I think the real question is, will people become concerned enough, people who benefit directly from what it is I was sort of lightly criticizing, right? How many of us want to go to the grocery store and have the shelves be empty? Or, you know, get online and want to buy ourselves, you know, some clothes and they're not available, or, you know, I want to, you know, drive my car and I can't get gasoline, or I can't get the oil for an oil change, or I can't get tires or whatever. So we are as much a part of the problem as we are a part of the solution. You know, the consumer culture that we all benefit from, whether or not unless we're living alone in a cave somewhere.
Okay, so you're suggesting that the need itself is going to drive our attitudes to do something.
Well, I mean, I'd like to think that recognition of the complexity and seriousness of the problem might persuade enough people to live a little bit lower on the, you know, on the economic spectrum. You know, but I don't see any sign right now that that's happening. I mean, it's certainly possible. I mean, there's certainly plenty of people that are concerned, but I don't see much evidence that that's fundamentally changing.
That was my sort of question. Is I feel that in the way that you're presenting things, you're saying that things have sort of a life of their own, but there isn't any sort of action one can take to direct the way things will go. They're just going to, people interact with the environment based on their values, but there isn't any way to really shift it in a way that can make a significant change in a timely manner. Or, well, it's not timely. They won't be timely as it is, but.
Well, I mean, there is. I mean, and that's why I talked about the environmental movement, right?
Mhm.
When that started, it really was a grassroots movement. Now, it isn't anymore. I would argue that it's not. You know, the environmental movement, if it's still around, has become professionalized, and, you know, they're organized. I mean, I probably, that's a rabbit hole I don't want to go down, but I mean, it is possible to change attitudes and values, but people have to be persuaded that there's a reason to do it. And the problem is that there has to be a critical mass of people who begin to think this way. And it's a little bit like there are problems with the old idea of the tragedy of the commons, you know, but what still is valid about it is that if we all think that there's, you know, too much whatever, you know, the automobiles are using too much resources, putting too much pollution in the air or whatever, so I decide that I'm not going to have a car unless we all decide that, or we all decide that we want more fuel efficient cars or electric cars or whatever. My deciding that I don't want to have a car simply hurts me, and everybody else benefits because there's one more car out there for somebody to buy. So I think the magic of the environmental movement is it was a time when a significant percentage of the American public began to realize that there was a problem and was willing to vote in such a way as to do something about it. It could happen again, but I don't see it happening right now. Let's put it that way. I hope I'm wrong, but.
Okay.
Good evening, folks. Good evening, folks. How y'all doing?
Yes. Okay, we have only a couple minutes, so what's your question, Blake?
My question is, what's the political outcome for electric cars in this country?
I don't think I'm the one who's qualified to answer that question. I can tell you that it's more easily, it's easier to own one now because there are more and more infrastructure to support it, right? My campus has charging stations. There are charging stations in downtown Indianapolis. I could buy one for my home if I wanted to, but I think we are far short now of the infrastructure to support those kinds of vehicles as opposed to, you know, gasoline or diesel powered things that run on highways. I mean, there's a start of a trend, but it's definitely still in the shadow of gasoline, diesel, and highways.
And they're too expensive.
Well, that's right. The price has to come down. That's right.
Yeah, it does.
But the price only comes down when we mass produce, and we only mass produce if there's a market for it. And
Right, and their rebates, you know, it's rebates as opposed to upfront
right.
off cost.
And you know, there's, you know, I think when the American automakers finally make the switch, people will follow. Right
Yeah.
now, it's hard to get an electric car. I mean, I'd like to buy one, but I couldn't just go out right now and just say I want that one and here's my whatever, my bucket of money, and I'd like to buy this. It doesn't, they're not available like that right now.
Right.
Valerie's got the last question because, okay.
Thank you.
Country, in the
Going
country.
back to your point about
This country, this
how
country,
important
this
it is what people
country,
believe,
this country,
what they
this
want,
country.
what
All right,
they're
just a minute. The last man who spoke, you've got a live mic. You want to mute it, please?
A country,
Thank you.
this country, this country.
Blake.
Yeah, the man who's talking
needs-
about this country.
Blake, you need to mute your mic, please.
Thank you. Okay, go for it.
Okay, so going back to your point about how much it matters what people think, what they want, what their dreams for the future are, I think many people, and probably all of us, fall into it sometimes just in order to keep on living. For many people, their hopes and dreams for the future are tied to a certain amount of denial about what is happening to the environment. Would you have any suggestions for how we can reach people kind of where they are, respecting what it is they want and long for, but also bringing them into the need to do something?
Oh, I mean, I don't have a magic answer for that. I mean, I have been telling this story for more than 30 years, and I've certainly, you know, connected with a lot of students. Every once in a while, 15, 20 years later, somebody will email you and say, you know, I took your environmental history class and it changed my life. But I mean, other than that, you just don't know. I think it's important for organizations to do their best to try to reach people, for, you know, places like nature museums to realize that there's more than just dinosaur bones and whatever, you know, to take the opportunity to try to tell the story that matters, and that's the relationship between people and their environment. We should be teaching this in schools. You know, I teach environmental history. Sometimes it gets students and sometimes it doesn't, you know, if it doesn't fit their plan of study. So there should be courses in universities and high schools, but even more importantly, that deal with this stuff. Given the curriculum rules in most states, I doubt that that's going to happen. But, you know, I get students who come to me out of the Indiana public school system, and what they know about science or history is pretty thin. You know, they certainly don't have much of a sense of how they fit into the world we all live in and share together.
Phil, I've got to cut you off because your class is starting.
Yeah, I gotta go. I'd like to thank people for being kind enough to listen.
Thank you very much. I
Thank you
appreciate
very
it.
much.
And
Well-
if we want to continue talking, let's do it.
Okay, so Michael, if I sign off here, am I gonna disrupt the link or anything?
No.
Okay, then I'm gonna leave. I'm gonna go tell my students I'm not dead. And
Thank you.
thank you all
so
very
much.
much. Take care.
Very interesting.
I'll be in Chicago in October. They're having an event at I think it's at the Nature Museum. Michael knows about that. So,
I'll fill in. I'll fill in for you.
all right, take care. Bye.
Okay, take care.
Bye, everybody.
Okay. Good night. He was just talking about, he's advising, the production of a film. And he, will be, at the October 8th, event, on the, film called, Look Like a Bite. And, that will be at Big Marsh. I think it starts at 12, something around noon, and then it ends at maybe 6 in the evening. I don't know. I don't have the exact dates, but he's been one of 6 advisors to the production of this film on the Anthropocene, by Dave McGowan of Ravenswood Media. And so, in fact, that's how I first got to know Bill, and so what he's talking about to me is just very interesting.
So I'm sorry, I have a question. So there's a film that's going to be shown at Big Marsh on October 8th?
No, it's about the Anthropocene and the production of this film that is just starting. It will probably take a year or so to do all the work on it, but that's the event.
Yo, Mike, I got one more question. Will the event be talking about ecological history of Wolf Lake?
Yes, in fact, he spoke at Peggy Nodebart Museum in April, I think, and he gave a talk along with others, and so there will be kind of a repeat of that meeting on October 8th, and this is in the southern part of Chicago where I am, so it's closer to me, but that will be October 8th. And I haven't sent the message out because he's Dave McGowan's in Rwanda right now, speaking to or teaching environmentalists over there on filming, and he's going to be back, I think, on the 15th.
And will there be more events about ecological history in the Calumet besides that one event on October the 8th?
That will be discussed, yeah, October 8th at Big Marsh. And I'll send out more information as plans are fully decided, and but that will be in a couple weeks.
And will it talk about more ethnobotany from the Calumet, both medicinal and edible?
Well, if you're there will be a discussion on that. I'm convinced of that. Okay. Yeah, we can.
All right.
You're perfect. You should be there, and you should let people know what you're doing.
All right.
Okay. Anything else?
No.
Okay. Well, thanks for joining the conversation, and I think Phil's probably will be at that October 8th meeting too. So you might, if you have a question that you forgot to ask you might approach him at that meeting. I don't know if he's going to be a speaker. He was the speaker at Peggy Notavart, but they're going to have different speakers. So I'm not sure that he'll be speaking, but I think he'll be there. Okay, thank you for showing up at our first forum of the year, and we'll see you next month then.
Okay,
Okay.
thanks, Mike.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Take care.